Welcome to Bloom, a podcast about anything and everything, which features conversations with people who led meaningful, interesting, and flourishing lives in order to better understand each other, ourselves, and the world around us. In this episode, I'm joined by my friend Lucy Walk, a Melbourne-based writer, editor, and interviewer. Together, we were lucky to interview acclaimed Australian philosopher and author Raimond Gaita. It's a long and rich conversation, beginning with the biography and history of the Gaita family's migration to Australia, before examining the literary impact of Romulus, my father, as well as tracing the philosophical influences of Gaita's work, and how these ethics and values might be applied to a range of contemporary issues. So, without further delay, I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as Lucy and I did. It's a great pleasure and honour to be joined here today with philosopher and award-winning author Raimond Gaita, who became known widely to the public through his book Romulus, my father, which is a moving eulogy about his father transformed into a book and years later a film. My high school philosophy teacher, who invited Raimond to give a lecture to philosophy students, noted that he writes and thinks beautifully, and you see a heart and mind at work. It's a great privilege to be here with you today, Ray, and thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. I'm honoured that you should want to do this.
And we're also joined today by my good friend Lucy Walk, who's a writer in Melbourne and has a wonderful history of doing radio and other live interviews as well. So, Lucy, great to be here with you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for that extremely generous introduction.
That's okay. So, Raymond, one of the things that strikes me about your life and career is how it has been informed and shaped by history and circumstance, and I suppose forces beyond the individual's control in many ways. So if you were to give a snapshot of your life story and work for our listeners who may not be familiar with you or your publications, how would you do so?
Well, I was born in Germany. That's important to a lot of my thinking, that I was born in Germany in 1946. And for a variety of reasons, mostly because my mother suffered badly from asthma and was advised that Melbourne, of all places, would be good for asthma. It's one of the worst places in the world. We came out in 1950. She suffered already, actually, when I was born, I'm quite sure, from what turned out to be manic depression. And symptoms of manic depression, not universally, but often tending to spend just a hell of a lot. And also a sort of heightened sexual desire, which often leads to promiscuity. And that led to my mother and father effectively separating when we got to Australia. She was in a camp in Bonegilla. We landed, both of us, three of us, went to Bonegilla. But my father, because of the conditions of his passage, was sent to work on the construction of a reservoir in central Victoria. And my mother stayed in Bonegilla, and people would come down to the camp in central Victoria. The location was Ken Curran, and they would tell my father that I was running wild, my mother was stealing their husbands. So I ended up in the camp with my father, though it was a men's only camp. But I was very fortunate in that he had met in that camp two Romanian friends. I should say, I didn't say this beforehand. My father was born in the former Yugoslavia, but in a Romanian village on the border, and he always considered himself to be a Romanian, and Romanian was his mother tongue. So he met these Romanian two brothers, one whose name was Pantelimon Hora, and the other, his name was Mitro Hora. Mitro was younger. And Pantelimon and my father shared night shift, day shift sort of rosters so that I could be looked after in this camp. But eventually the authorities said that I had to leave because children were not permitted in the camp, and so we managed to rent a dilapidated farmhouse in central Victoria, where my father and I lived for about 10 years, or a little longer actually. And my mother came occasionally to visit but to cut a long story short, she fell in love with Mitchell, Parton-Moore's brother, and who had been a close friend of my father's. They lived together, had a daughter, Susan, and my mother was pregnant with another daughter, Barbara, when Mitchell killed himself, largely because he had become desperate, I think, because of her promiscuity and spending. He would earn £6 a week or something like that, and she might buy a dress for £20, which meant that he was working 2 jobs. She was incapable of looking after Susan. Genuinely incapable. I mean, it's not that she didn't want to, she just couldn't. And that drove him to such desperation that he killed himself. And she killed herself about 2 years after that, on the eve of her 30th birthday. When I wrote, interestingly, perhaps I might as well say this now, at this stage of the conversation, when I thought I should write about my life, having been encouraged by the response I got to the eulogy that I published, that I'd given at my father's funeral. I didn't want to publish it originally, but people pressed me to do it. I then thought I might write a book, and thought, well, I'll write it on weekends and so on. But what drove me finally to write the book, which completely surprised me, was that my daughter had given me a tape for my 50th birthday of music she liked and thought I hoped I would like and so on. And on that tape there was a song by a country and western singer called Emmylou Harris. And the song, its refrain was called Goodbye, and as refrain, I can't remember if we said goodbye. It's not a great song, but she has a haunting voice, and for whatever reason, it really got to me. And in this very room, I played it for a week on those quite, you'll see behind me, and those quite big speakers, and all the glasses in that cabinet over there were rattling.
Shaking, yeah.
But I thought always about my mother as I was listening to this. And then I said eventually to Yael, my wife, that I was going off to the country, to where I grew up, to write. So in fact I was inspired to write this book. I don't know if inspired is the right word, but anyway, I'm perhaps enabled, occasioned, I don't know what the word is, to write this book, think about my father, thinking about my mother. And it's a book I wrote in 3 weeks, the first draft, and sort of mad intensity.
Feverish is how you described it. Yeah.
Feverish, sort of oscillating between joy and depression. But the first week, I wrote about my mother. 1 week in 3 is quite a lot. So when people ask me, as naturally they do, why did you write this book? I honestly have to say I don't know why I wrote it. I mean, there's an answer on the surface, which is I wanted to celebrate my father's values. But I could have written some kind of, well, in fact I did in a book afterwards called After Romulus. I wrote an essay in which I quite explicitly discussed the effects that his thinking and his life, mostly his life, had not only on my thought about how one should live, but on meta, what in philosophy called meta questions about the very nature of morality. So I could have done that if all I wanted to do was to reflect upon his values. So there was also the fact that I think instinctively I wanted to tell a story and write it in a narrative form. But then there was always the constant thought about my mother, and though she well, halfway through the book, she's gone. I mean, she's died. But about 15 years later, I wrote an essay about her, called An Unassuageable Longing, which, the title speaks for itself.
Thank you very much for that. As we mentioned earlier, you're best known for Romulus, My Father, and you've done a whole range of other philosophical works such as A Common Humanity and The Philosopher's Dog, and a range of other different works as well. But if we were to sort of ground the discussion in Romulus as both sort of text and film, I think it's sort of neatly encapsulated by Helen Garner's summation of it in The Monthly some years ago. And she wrote, and I quote, "It's a story of suffering, obsessive love, sexual betrayal and jealousy, abandonment of small children, violence, madness and despair, 2 suicides, repeated acts of forgiveness and loyalty that are nothing short of heroic, and threaded through all this, the miraculous blossoming of a child's intellect. The book changed the quality of the literary air in this country. People often take an unusually emotional tone when they speak about it, as if it had performed for them the function that Franz Kafka demanded. A book must be the act for the frozen sea within us. Reading it, with its stiff, passionate dignity and its moral demands, can smash open a reader's blocked-off sorrows. Out they rush to meet those that the book relates." There's a lot to unpack there, but what stands out most for me is the profound impact that the book, simply and movingly told, seems to have on people of all walks of life over the past 21 years. So why do you think this is the case?
To tell you the truth, I don't know. Before we started this, we talked a little about a time I went last year to Melbourne Grammar School to talk, to a philosophy class, but also to astonishingly a Year 9 class on Romulus, My Father. First of all, I was surprised how well they understood this book, which I wouldn't have thought. But I was also surprised that these young people, and it's happened many times before when I've talked to school kids, and I always think of what they prize most of all is a kind of cool urbanity, coolness above all, and that they should be so taken. Well, I'm sure a lot of them aren't, but a lot are taken by a book which is about a man and celebrates his passionate intensity. I've sometimes thought about my own work that I could probably truthfully subtitle just about everything I've written against urbanity. So it has surprised me, and I don't know. I tell the story in a book called After Romulus of a time when I was asked to give a reading of Romulus. It was just after it had been published at the Sacred Heart Mission, which is not far from here in St Kilda. And I had refused at first because I thought they'd not come for literature, they come for lunch. And I felt it would just seem presumptuous. But I was convinced to do it, and I was asked. I asked for how long should I read, and normally when I read, it would be for 30 minutes or 40, and people then would ask questions. And the man who was in charge said to me, "Try 10 minutes." And I was there for 2.5 hours.
Wow.
I had to just say, "I'm sorry, I've just got to go." But what was for me really profound about that occasion was that there was a man sitting at a table probably 1.5 meters from me, and he was obviously to me mentally ill, and I could see by the way he had his hands around his head and looked, and suddenly he exclaimed, "There's God in this book." And I had, as a student, worked in a mental hospital, and being very idealistic, I had started a debating society called Larundel Literary and Debating Society. And at the first meeting, a young man who'd been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic picked up a chair and hit another one into the face with the chair, and that was the end of Larundel. And when this man said, "Mike, there's God in this book," he said, "I mean, it's filled with love." And not long after, he got up and walked around the room and threw up his arms, and again in an exclamatory voice, said, "Your father was a genius." And he then explained, "I mean a genius of the spirit." And I was incredibly moved by this. But I was also very moved by the fact that, well, sitting also roughly the same distance from me was a group of young women, I don't think any of them were 20, who were street girls feeding heroin habit. And they asked me to read again and again and again and again about my mother. And I assumed because they somehow saw in her broken, tormented life something of their own. And I don't know if this is true, I hope it is true. Anne Mann wrote in the introduction to the Text Classics edition that she surmised that those girls hoped that somehow their life might be viewed with the same compassion that Anne thinks the book shows towards my mother.
Yes.
And the thing that apart from all that being very moving for me in itself, much more moving than anything else that's happened in regard to the book, and has mattered to me much more than all the praise and so on it's received, is the fact that I and this didn't occur to me straight away, but afterwards I realised that I had managed to find a voice in that book that could speak with to people who suffered really terrible affliction, and in a way that didn't condescend in any way to their affliction. Even though I've made a bit of a joke about this fellow, being quite mad actually, but it was something that I know was true of my father, that he could respond, and he responded indeed to a friend of ours who was quite mad, a man called Vatsek, and who was visibly mad, talked to himself, cooked in his urine and so on, without a trace of condescension. Something I myself had consciously come to realise, although I must have instinctively realised it already as a boy, but I consciously come to realise, indeed after I'd written the book, and I was on a publicity tour with a couple of journalists from the Age, and I took them to where Vatsek had lived amongst these two boulders that he covered with bits of whatever. And one of them said, "Did Vatsek appear weird to you as a kid?" And I said, "No." And then afterwards I thought, why the hell didn't I think he was weird as a kid? He was weird. And I realised then that it was because, and it wasn't just my father was forward to had responded to Vatsek without a trace of condescension, which if there'd been even a trace of it, I would have, with a kind of cruel sensitivity that children have realised that Vatsek wasn't entirely one of us. Even though I would have liked him, because he was very kind to me and always was kind to me, and obviously I would have liked him, but I wouldn't have been able to respond so spontaneously without thinking to that question, was he weird, by saying no, had he not appeared to me in the light that my father's behaviour cast on him. So, and that has been, when I said before that I wrote after Romulus an essay reflecting on what I had learned from my father, then that was one of the most important things I had learned from my father, and came to witness again in a much more dramatic form when I was a young man working in a psychiatric hospital.
In one sense, what a beautiful thought that the ideal reader and the most prized audience for your work is not a critic or a professor, but is someone who that sense of affliction and the sense of being understood or compassionately viewed is most relevant to. I think it's unsurprising, having read the book and read the stories of Hora and Romulus, that might be your ideal audience. One thing that actually strikes me in that story that you were telling is that it reminds me so much of Simone Weil, who's a sort of philosopher, activist, mystic, who clearly has been a kind of constant thread in your work. And you tell that story in A Common Humanity, where you sort of reflect on her belief that compassion for the afflicted is miraculous, and advance that distinction between the coldness and distance of egalitarianism and a more complicated notion of goodness. I was wondering, if you could tell us about, how you came across her and what she means to you and the way that she comes through in your work.
I came across her where I wasn't interested in moral philosophy as a student. I went to England, in fact, to work on logic and metaphysics. Moral philosophy I thought was tedious, and I had no axe to grind about changing moral philosophy. So, but someone had recommended to me Iris Murdoch's book, The Sovereignty of Good, and which I liked, but it never occurred to me that I would go on to do moral philosophy. But she was very much influenced by Simone Weil. Then I read Simone Weil, and I responded immediately to her because of what she says about affliction. And the reason I responded immediately to her was because of an experience. Well, there was my father, of course, and Leipzig, and also because of the affliction I had seen in my father, and a time when he came indeed to my school. I tell the story more as Romulus, my father, and my father was quite mad. He'd been in a psychiatric hospital, and he came looking evidently mad. I could perhaps read the description,
of course,
from the book, if I can find it. I'm really bad at finding things. But my father came to visit me at the school with Leipzig, and this is how I write about it in Romulus, my father. A few weeks later, he visited me at school in Ballarat with Leipzig. As soon as I saw him, I knew that his illness had again overtaken him. He came dressed in a dishevelled navy pinstripe suit with a dirty white shirt, open at the neck, the collar partly covered by the collar of his jacket. He seemed shrunken, stooped, not with age, he was only 39, but with the burden of his affliction. Most startling was his face, thin, unshaven, his eyes, not dead as is often the case with depression, but burning with the terror of his visions, all made worse by the fact that his almost shaven head made him look as though he'd come from a concentration camp. Leipzig walked beside him in an equally shabby beige suit and open dirty shirt, wearing as ever his beanie. He no longer had a beard, and his open, amiable face was covered in stubble. His eyes focused on no one, his lips were hardly ever still, moving in sometimes silent, sometimes audible conversation with himself or imaginary partners. Afterwards, a teacher asked me if one of the men had been my father. No, I replied. I was later tormented with guilt and shame for having denied my father, but I knew not quite for what I was ashamed, because I also knew that, terrible though it was, my denial was not prompted by cowardice. I think it's in After Romulus, I reflect on that passage, and because it's very dense there, when I say it wasn't guilt, I was filled with guilt and shame. And I think I was no longer able to see in my father his full humanity because of his affliction. What I was able to see as a boy in Leipzig, and which he enabled me to see, had deserted me by the time I myself was a teenager at school. And I'm sure something like that is true, because it would be too, astonished if the teachers who've been teaching this don't simply say, "Oh, Ray was very embarrassed," or something like that, or felt embarrassed in front of his peers. And although that probably played a part in it, I think it went much deeper than that, and the deeper thing that's revealed in something like that is that it is, as Simone Weil says, that it's almost impossible to see the full humanity of someone who's radically afflicted. And for that reason, it's almost impossible to respond to them with a compassion that is not in some way laced with condescension.
That a sort of a compassion that comes from a principled egalitarianism cannot avoid being condescending.
Well, it needn't be that either, because I don't know if it will take up too much time to tell the story about that nun in.
It's fine, yeah.
When I was 16 or 17, I can't remember. I worked as a ward assistant in a psychiatric hospital, and for 3 months in a ward where people some had been for 20 or 30 years. In the time I was there, not one of them had a visitor, and they were treated really, really brutishly. If you've seen the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, then it was really a bit like that, but worse actually. And as an example of how brutish it could be, often when they sat in this sort of gravel yard under the one tree that provided a bit of shade, and then soiled themselves as happened, you were really asked to just shove them under a shower and prodding them into the shower with a mop, and washing it down under that shower. Simone Weil has a wonderful expression where at one stage she says that people who are radically afflicted, the silent cry that she says comes from the heart, usually when people are hurt, which is a cry, "Why am I being hurt?" Is sometimes silent, but it's never dead. It's just that they are struck with a dumb and mute lamentation, and that somehow characterised these people, and they were treated brutishly by the nursing staff and by most of the psychiatrists. But there was in that hospital a small group of psychiatrists who treated them well, and who were ridiculed by their colleagues as being naive idealists, and who were really stuffing things up really rather than making things better. But one of them, in fact, spoke to me. It was the first time I heard the expression of the inalienable dignity of even those people. And I didn't understand what that expression meant, but it moved me. So I was very, very impressed by these psychiatrists, by their compassion, by their preparedness to put up with ridicule, by how hard they worked. But one day a nun came into the ward, and at first there was nothing at all remarkable about her, but when she started moving amongst the patients, I was suddenly wonderstruck by the fact that her demeanour and her tone of voice when speaking to them revealed to me that she responded to them without a trace of condescension. But the reason that I was so struck by that was that I had still before my eyes, even there, so to speak, the behaviour of psychiatrists, whom I had so admired, and I realised only when the nun behaved as she did towards them, that they, and I too, had responded to these patients with a kind of benign condescension. There was, I tell this story in A Common Humanity, and I've tried to tell it in other places because I keep trying to capture the right words in characterising my astonishment. I sometimes wanted to describe it as an affront to reason. I wanted to emphasise that it's not merely that reason can't capture it, because I think it's true of all morality actually, that it's not underwritten by reason. So I wouldn't say, look, here's something that's astonishing because reason can't capture. That's why I sometimes use the word like an affront to reason, deeply and profoundly unnatural. And there was an occupational therapist in that hospital, and and I'm mentioning her in response to your remark about egalitarianism. She was a wonderfully warm-hearted woman, and she was very, very calm when these patients came to occupational therapy. But she too responded. I realised, again, only after having been a witness to the nuns' behaviour, she too, the occupational therapy responded with an element of condescension. And when I describe her behaviour in After Romulus, I say I suspect she would have found it unintelligible that there was any other way properly to behave.
Right.
And I suspect she might have said, to suggest there's some other way to respond to them, other than with a loving but benign condescension, would be insulting to them, because that's the truth about their condition. And she might even go on to say, how can you be so stupidly high-minded as to pretend anything else? And so I've tried so many times to try to capture what was so astonishing and extraordinary about this, and why I've referred to my own response to it as a kind of active witness, which I would never want to say about ordinary moral things, even though I've spent a lot of time arguing with it. Reason won't underwrite our most basic moral concepts. But because I've written about her, and probably in this way, and because I've talked and said that what she revealed, if I wanted to talk about it, would be the inalienable preciousness of even these people. The reason I call it inalienable is because affliction can't take it away. You are not alienated from it by affliction. I've wanted to argue that in this kind of case, what we call the inalienable dignity of human beings is revealed, in fact, in that kind of saintly love. And the reason I have, later on in my work, though I haven't yet published it, I'm writing a book for Columbia University Press, in which I'll write about this, have been so resistant now to talk of inalienable dignity, is because it's always inflected in an heroic key. And in fact, it's been used in political struggles against oppression precisely because of that heroic key. And because but I want to say it creates the illusion that no matter how, so Hervé again has this expression that some people suffer such affliction that they're on the ground writhing on the ground like a half-crushed worm. That's the position that people can be reduced to, and to pretend that in that position they could open their shirts, as it were, like Superman used to open, Clark Kent used to reveal the S, but not an S, but a big D, the dignity that though you've lost anything that people would call dignity, and so manifestly they've lost it, you've got a dignity that you can't lose. I think that's an illusion, but a very noble illusion. But it's the concept. But the concept of nobility itself is a concept in a heroic key. And this is what I learnt in that hospital. That those people weren't like that. However you might respond to the nun's behaviour, it wasn't revealing the heroic dimension of such people. Because of this, people have thought I'm a tossed Christian. But I keep saying I'm not religious. Though I do think that it's partly in the history of Christianity and the deeds of saintly love that we've been able to affirm such what would seem a kind of ridiculous thing. To affirm anything beyond what this wonderful social occupational therapist, that there could be something beyond. But because I think it's so astonishing, I wouldn't want to criticise the occupational therapist. I think it's in a common humanity. I actually say the nun's behaviour showed up the psychiatrist. I would not say that anymore, because that sounds like a criticism of them, and it doesn't capture, as it were, the distance, because it makes it sound as though they're on a line and the nun's a little bit further up the line. You know, a superwoman of compassion, where they were just ordinary mortal. The occupational therapist a little lower, and the nursing staff right. The idea that she's on a line, really high up on a line, is for me mistakes the character of her compassion. But the other reason, and this is why I mentioned before, that it is important to my sense of things that I was born in Germany, is that I'm married to a Jewish wife. And there's hardly a day goes by, and I have Jewish stepchildren, hardly a day goes by in my life where I'm not conscious of the fact that in the lifetime of my parents, they would have been eliminated as though they were vermin unfit to inhabit the earth. And that was made possible in part, not only, but certainly in significant part, by centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. So for me to be tempted to Christianity, let's say, would be, for me, a betrayal of my Jewish family.
I'm just reflecting on the fact that this whole process of, this book and this line of thinking and what you've become to the public began with a simple eulogy as well. What I wonder about that is, in a eulogy, who do you think the audience is? Is it the dead or is it the living?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought of. Well, let me first of all say that I think you can, the dead can be an audience. And I've tried to argue in my work that the dead can be irreducibly the object of our obligations, our pity, and so on. And that we ought not to think that this depends on any belief in their having survived their death or anything like that. And people are tempted, of course, when you say, well, of course, I don't believe they've survived their death, then they're going to say what you're really talking about is the memory of the dead, not the dead, in some way or other. So how can, if you admit that they're gone, how can they be the object of your pity? To which I simply say that they're gone is just to say they're dead. It was always a really interesting exercise for students, actually, in seminars. I write on the blackboard, can the dead be harmed? Question mark. And then students would always say, of course they can't be harmed if they're dead. I mean, of course, if they survived in some way, they might be harmed. And they said, well, they can't feel anything. I said, well, that's true, they're dead. Isn't you see on the blackboard, can the dead be harmed? Then they say, well, how can they be upset by anything? And well, they can't upset. They're dead. So the tendency was always to say, to object to the idea that the dead could be the irreducible objects of, let's say, an obligation or pity. it would always be to say, how can you pity them if they're dead? They don't feel anything. And to which you say, of course they don't feel anything, they're dead. And it was a very, very interesting exercise, because their thought was the dead could not be the irreducible objects of our thoughts, around our obligations, or our pity, unless they weren't really dead. But of course, to the ancient Greeks, it wasn't because they believed in the gods that they pitied Achilles when he was, Hector when he was being dragged around the walls. So, in answer to your question, I'd say when you're giving a eulogy, it's very important that you honour the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And what that demands by way, well, of this respect, that you don't dishonour the dead.
But not necessarily because they can feel.
I want to say that doesn't mean dishonour their memory, which is quite different. Or let me put it, if you're dishonouring their memory, that is by saying things that are untruthful about them. What's wrong about that is you're dishonouring them. So what the consequences of that are for truth-telling in a eulogy, people can argue about.
Mm.
I think everybody's prepared in the case of a eulogy to allow a little latitude for the exaggeration of virtue. But there comes a point in which, if for the sake of your audience, your eulogy is quite untruthful, then I would want to say the person for whom that eulogy is being given is being dishonoured.
In the eulogy that you gave for your father, did you feel that you had the opportunity to have said those things, or were they understood between you before his death, or in some sense?
No, I don't think there were. It was a kind of revelation to me, actually. My father and I don't try to hide this in Romulus, my father, had sometimes a very tempestuous relationship. But the fact that the tribute I paid him came out so spontaneously, and I think truthfully. I asked Hoare after I wrote the book what he thought of the book. He said it tells the truth, which for me was very, very important. So, yeah, it was a kind of revelation.
The thing for me about the end of the book is when you're saying to your father in German, I love you, mein Vater, I love you, mein Vater, and then the last words that essentially your father heard before he passed on. There's that sort of small indication of the love that you bore for your father, which didn't fully become, I suppose, manifested and fleshed out until you wrote the eulogy and then the memoir and the book that we have here, which is a work of non-fiction. And it is a huge gesture to honour the memory of your father. But I think even in that sort of those final moments with your father and that understood affection and love that you had while living, that strikes me as being quite mould breaking, I think, in a lot of Australian society in which, relations between men, especially fathers and sons or friends, are often sort of almost exclusively sort of non-emotional. We sort of are afraid to step into that space. And one of the amazing things that I think that your work has done in selling so many copies and becoming sort of so widely known and part of the lore of Australia, and even it's been translated as well, is to go back to Lucy's point as well about intended audience. Giving your father a sort of a life beyond death through memory, but also help to expand the possibilities of masculinity, I think.
Well, I hadn't thought of that. Certainly wasn't my intention to do it. If anything, as I've already indicated, writing Romulus, my father, has made it absolutely clear to me that authors aren't the best people. Certainly their views on their books of this kind and can't be authoritative. In a book of philosophy, if someone says, I don't think this argument is any good, I'll say, well, tell me why, and I'll either accept that it's not or argue that it is. And it's relatively simple. But in a book of, like Romulus, my father, if somebody says to me, well, I find your writing about your mother quite cold, which some people have said, then I can, or the only thing I can say is, well, I hope you're wrong, and say others don't find it, but there's nothing I can do which is the equivalent of saying, tell me why you think this argument is not a valid argument. Or tell me why you think the facts are not as I claim them to be, or whatever. My father was not himself a physically affectionate man. Certainly, I mean, not to me. I think I am a physically affectionate person. My wife keeps saying to me, how come you emerge like this? But there are all sorts of ways in which I knew that he expressed his love for me very deeply.
Absolutely.
All through my life. And so I was never unsure of his love. And on one occasion when I did say to him, you don't love me, and he was really upset and said, you mean that? And I said, I did mean it, but that was only because I wanted to upset him, not because I didn't mean it.
So one of the more, I think, extraordinary aspects of Romulus as both text and film is the depiction and poetic descriptions of what are sort of conventionally understood to be quite harsh central Victorian landscapes where you and your family found yourselves. Can you reflect on this further in naturalistic and poetic terms? So what is it about the landscape that sort of, I guess, impelled you to sort of write about it in ways that I haven't sort of come across in a lot of Australian literature? But also how, this distinctive country fostered in you a sense of the beautiful, the sublime and the transcendent, along with a sense of home and belonging in Australia, while it was such a different case for your mother and father in that it sort of persisted as a reminder of their own displacement from their homeland in Europe, perhaps rendering them as a stranger in a strange land, as it were?
Yeah, well, a sense of how that countryside can appear on a summer's day to someone from Europe or England, and in this case, I'm talking about an English person. I went with my German cousin and her English husband to where the house had stood, Frogmore, where I grew up. And the husband is quite a laconic, not at all an emotionally expressive boy from Birmingham. And we were standing there, and he leant against a fence post, and I thought he was just resting, and he was looking at the remains of the house, and I looked at him and I saw tears in his eyes, and afterwards he said, I thought how hard it would have been for your mother. So for a laconic lad from Birmingham, who would be very reluctant generally to express his emotions, or even to say, I don't know if he has said, I hope he has said, to my cousin, I love you.
Yeah.
You might find that, even that hard,
Yeah.
let's say,
Mm.
to become tearful and need the support of a fence post when he saw how harsh this landscape was and how hard it must have been for a young woman from a German city who was in love with culture in all sorts of ways to live there. But for me, because I think partly because I grew up there with such freedom, able to ride my father's motorbike when I was 11 all over the place. I'm sure it was in part because at 11 years old I had an epiphany.
Mm.
When I went to shoot some rabbits, all my friends killed rabbits. They were a real pest. And you could get 2 shillings for a pair or something like that.
Mm.
And I was a bit embarrassed by the fact that I was not that kind of country boy, so I thought, well, why not? So I took my father's rifle and his motorbike, I was 11, and drove to this spot and walked up this hill. And it was about 5 o'clock on a summer's afternoon, and the sun lit up the long yellow grasses that were swaying in the wind, and it's a rocky sort of landscape, so they're very impressive boulders everywhere too. I just suddenly fell in love with it. And as I say in Romulus, my father, I was awakened with a kind of shock to the beauty of the natural world.
It harks back to that Iris Murdoch sort of notion of transcendence through nature as well.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I rather regret using the word transcendence.
Like a mystic, yeah.
Transcendence at that point, because it can carry sort of mystical overtones that I'm not so sure that I want, and I don't want it to feed into people's idea that I'm really a closet Christian.
Yeah.
So, but an expression I have used, although not in that passage, but I think later when I talk about sailing with Hora on Ken Curran and my sense of the natural world then was that it awakened in me a kind of love of the world, which I've sometimes called unconditional, though of course it's not unconditioned, it's conditioned by all sorts of things, but unconditional in that it's not based on a simple assessment of whether things are going well in the world or whether they're not going well in the world. And it seems to be one of the most important things if one can encourage in young people a love of the world. One which, because one never knows what the future is going to be like. One never knows whether one's going to end up living in a dark age where the amount of evil in the world could make you curse the day you were born. And that's why on the one hand it might sound airy-fairy, but on the other hand, and this can be done actually through, it's not just the natural world, it can be done through art, for example. In The Philosopher's Dog, I quote Pablo Casals talking about that every morning for 80 years, he says, he would go to the piano and play a prelude or fugue of Bach, and he said he calls it a kind of benediction on the house, and says that it reminds him, I think his phrase is, the incredible marvel of being a human being, and says there's not a day when he hasn't been awakened with a fresh amazement of the beauty of nature. So in that absolutely wonderful passage, which is so obviously written in the key of gratitude, you have the connection of the natural world or the human world. I mean, incredible marvel of being a human being. It's not just nature. You could never imagine such a person for the person who wrote that passage being a misanthrope, for example. And that's very important because there are people, especially these days with climate change being such a terrible threat to humankind, there are increasingly a number of people who are becoming misanthropic, saying it's the human beings who fucked everything up. There's transhumanism, posthumanism, and in all sorts of ways, the ethically inflected ways in which we talk about humanity, like in the expression a common humanity, are being in one way or another undercut. So what I think is wonderful about that passage from Casals is it brings together if you like, a transcendent, but all I mean by this now, that it transcends any assessment of whether the good in the world is outweighing the bad in the world. That's all I would really mean by that. And I've sometimes quoted in this connection a passage of Wittgenstein's remark on his deathbed. He says to his doctor, tell them, meaning his friends, that it's been a wonderful life. And the person who reports this, Norm, is a student of his, Norman Malcolm, in his memoir, says how moved but also surprised he was that Wittgenstein would say that, because in many ways his life was an unhappy one.
Yeah.
But what's clear, it seems to me, from the way it's written, and also other things one knows about Wittgenstein, that he wasn't making an assessment of his life. He wasn't saying something which would make it logically or conceptually appropriate to say, even if it might be presumptuous, but still conceptually appropriate to say, come on, Wittgenstein, you sure was wonderful. It wasn't just, I mean, really, realistically, it's hard to say it was good. But so it wasn't, it was as much as Casals, it was an expression of gratitude for his life. And again, one by the sort of parody that one can see by the parody that I just made, is not vulnerable to a line of working out, how much good there was in it. And there's a point in which you say, for God's sake, it must have been absolutely miserable.
I was just remembering the final tweet. It's all been bloody marvellous.
Mark.
This is the problem.
What's
his last name was escaping me, and he used to host PM. And the sound.
Mark Colvin.
Mark Colvin.
Yeah. That reminded me of that tweet as well.
His final tweet, and he was such a prolific user of Twitter. So apologies for lowering us sort of from the sublime to the tweeting, but the same sentiment, I think, came through his last few years had not been bloody marvellous or anything close to it.
The last 2 decades, really, he suffered from chronic illnesses. Was in hospital a lot.
Yeah.
But it also reminded me of Oliver Sacks's, who's an American, I think British actually, medic. One of his final books he published was called Gratitude, simply. But at the end of his life, and I think he died prolonged death from cancer, was an overwhelming feeling he had of gratitude for being a sentient being on this marvellous blue planet. I think that sort of sentiment is echoed in Colvin, but also through what you referenced there as well.
You're writing a book about gratitude or
it's
around
a book
the theme?
About people who really matter to me.
Yeah.
And it's going to be called Portraits in Love and Gratitude. And most of the people are unknown to the world, as it were. I mean, some are philosophers who have known. But it's not biographies of them. In one way, it could almost be an intellectual biography.
Yeah.
Autobiography.
In saying that, I think one of the things about Romulus, my father, that has always struck me is that it's this form of moral education that seems so rare, particularly in this day and age, in the sense that it uses the lives of real people, which is something that you've sort of spoken about, horror emphasising, and believing that it was very important that you tell stories of real men and women who have lived in order to understand qualities of goodness and virtue. So that part of it has always seemed very sort of different to the time in which we live, and also the fact that it celebrates lives that were not lived on a grand scale either, and it doesn't celebrate people who achieve celebrity or fame or power, and it doesn't occur in a fantasy world. It doesn't use sort of religious figures. It tells those stories. Do you feel that that's a form of moral education that is lacking, or that we could use more of?
Well, I think we learn through being moved by examples that strike us as authoritative. And I don't think we learn morality from a set of principles. I don't think my father had any principles. He's often described as a man of strong and often rather rigid principles.
Moral severity or something, severe judgments.
He could be morally severe. And one of the things I learned from him, that you could be morally severe without being judgmental.
Yes.
And moral philosophy is obsessed with praise and blame. Philosophy students studying freedom of the will, they say, God, if the will is not free, we can't blame anybody. Really. The worst thing in the world is that you should not be able to blame. And who needs your praise anyway? That was a very important lesson that I learned from my father, that there could be such a thing as a kind of severe pity for somebody. Severe because it was insistent that a moral description of their conduct was the case, that they had done something morally bad and terrible and even. But the appropriate attitude might be, or certainly some people's attitude just is, one of sorrow or pity for that person. And that's partly why I think I was moved to say in Romulus, my father, that I compared my father to to Socrates, but that he shared the Socratic belief that it's better to suffer evil than to do it. And Socrates did claim in the same dialogue in which he enunciated that evildoers are necessarily miserable and pitiable. And I emphasize them necessarily because it's not because of anything else they will suffer. And there's in fact a wonderful moment in that dialogue which philosophers often miss because it's a literary moment. I mean, what's powerful is its literary quality, where Socrates has enunciated the idea that it's better to suffer evil than to do it, which his interlocutors are just incredulous that anybody could think something so stupid. And one of them, Polus, says to him, come on now, there's this tyrant Archelaus, and he's done terrible things. He got to power by putting his brother down a well, murdering his brother. But everything's fine. You're going to tell me that he's miserable and pitiable? And Socrates replies, I don't know how he stands in regard to good and evil. I take it he means by that I don't know if your description of him is true. Not that I don't know
how
if
to judge those actions.
And Polus, so having said I don't know how he stands in relation to good and evil, Polus says with shock, what? It depends just on that? And Socrates says, yes, just. Now this is a moment of great pathos in the dialogue, which gets missed because it's a moment of great pathos. And because most commentators say what Socrates means is that in the end, if you lack virtue, you won't flourish. And there's even a myth at the end of the Gorgias about the afterlife and so on. But Plato was a great artist, and he wouldn't have a moment of such one extraordinary pathos and then undermine it all by saying at the end, oh well, if you don't cop it in this life, you'll cop it in the next. So it will be a complete failure. So Socrates did actually think if you really understood what it was, if you really understood the evil you're confronted with in the deeds of a particular person, if you really understood that, you would pity that person. Now that's a very strong point. That is conditional, as it were, upon understanding that you pity the person. But you can make there's a weaker version of the point, which is we know that, let's say, mothers or fathers or parents sorrow over their children if they've done something morally terrible. Because they've done something morally terrible. And if they're lacking in remorse, they'll sorrow even more. So it's not that they're sorrowing because they're remorseful and unhappy and miserable in that sense. And it's not that they're sorrowing because they fear that, as a matter of fact, other consequences will follow, which might be the case. They sorrow because they've become terrible wrongdoers. And a person who's seriously remorseful, it's not that person sorrows for himself, because that would be self-pity, inconsistent with a serious remorse. But that person is shocked. I mean, I've often written that the characteristic expressions of remorse are a bewildered, shocked recognition of oneself as a wrongdoer, as a form of understanding, not an emotional response to the fact that you violated a principle, for example, or not an emotional response to an independently characterizable understanding of wrongdoing. It's an expression of that understanding. And so much of my work has been trying to emphasize that it's through coming to fully understand certain kinds of examples with which what's confronting. But of course, you have to reflect on the fact that you're moved by those examples. Right? You can't just accept them. But it would be naive, because you might be moved because you're sentimental or given to pathos or goodness knows why. But what I wanted to emphasize in my work is that it's not enough. If somebody says, look, you need rationally to assess how you are moved, I want to say, well, of course you do, but the concept of a rational assessment doesn't exhaust the critical concepts you have to deploy in that assessment. You might have been irrational, but more often, actually, the reason we're moved when we shouldn't be moved is not because we're being irrational, it's because we've been given to kitsch, we're deaf to tone, and so on. And I've wanted to argue against philosophers like, for example, Peter Singer,
several episodes back.
That there's a very narrow conception of reason. It's not that I want to say that reason. My point is not that reason has its limits, and after that we give over to emotion. I want to say there's no such thing as reason. There's thinking well and thinking badly. That's what there is. And whether you're thinking well or badly depends on what you're thinking about. What kind of concepts govern thinking about this or that domain of reflection. And if you come out of the theatre and say, God, I've really come to see something. I've never understood this before. Never, or sort of understood it, but not so deeply. Then I might say to you, yeah, I know you feel that. You're always yielding to your sentimentality. Every time we go to the theatre together, you come out saying this and this and this. Now, I might be right, I might be wrong, right? But that's a concept that needs to come into play in a critical assessment of how we are moved by art in one. And what's striking, if you do any course in moral philosophy, in the English-speaking world at any rate, there'll be lots of talk about reason, moral objectivity, are moral judgments true, are they false, are they objective, are they not objective, and all that. But you won't hear a discussion of what do concepts like you're being sentimental, you've yielded to pathos. What role do they play in our assessment of whether you're thinking badly or well or badly? Of whether, to take the big Socratic category, whether you're being legitimately persuaded, right, or whether you're being illegitimately taken to, even if it's a true belief.
Mm.
I just wanted to emphasise that because I don't want in any way to be taken as someone who's a kind of irrationalist.
Yeah, or an advocate for a false distinction between reason and emotion.
No,
something along those lines.
And I'd say let's get rid of the concept of reason. Rationality has its place, a limited place. It's really important. I take it as just obvious that you have to try to be rational. I take it should be obvious too if we actually reflect on the concepts with which we assess whether we've been rightly persuaded to believe something or to make a claim to understanding something more deeply, that we need other concepts as well to assess that. And when people get moved by someone like Trump and so on, it's not just because reason has deserted them and been thrown into a ditch. It's because they...
At the outset of Romulus, you cite Plato, who said that those who love and seek wisdom are clinging in recollection to things they once saw. You go on to list how many of the virtues and qualities of character that defined your life you learned from observing and emulating both your father and Hora. South African novelist J.M. Coetzee later noted that Romulus comes to serve as a lifelong moral compass to you, and via you, to us as readers. This is all neatly encapsulated by the image of the bees being given life by light and heat, which frames the film, which is reminiscent of Plato's famous analogy of the sun, with the sun as representative of the life-giving good, which is kind of like what Romulus and Hora were like to you. Could you reflect on Plato's influence on your writing and life?
Well, there are a number of issues there. One is the metaphor of vision and light in the sun. And in fact, someone's wanting to write a book about my work, in which is, I think, the title is going to be something like seeing, I don't know, seeing the world is okay, or some. Anyway, the thing is on emphasis on seeing, and in a way, look, it's very natural to say that, to see the world this way, and in fact I say, I came to see Vatsik in the light cast.
Yes, he did say, yeah, that's right.
But on the other hand, I really want to emphasise speech, because I think I learned from my father and from Horan through their conversation. What it was to be able to be someone who has something to say, and that conversation, as in the loaded sense in which we speak of conversation, when we said last I had a real conversation with somebody. Last I really found someone to talk to. Through my father and Hora, but especially through Hora, actually, I realised how fundamental the possibility of such conversation, how fundamental to the possibility of such conversation is the idea of what I have called a call to seriousness. That no matter how light-hearted a conversation may be, at any time something could come up and someone might say, for God's sake, how can you say that? I never believed you would say such a thing. And then there has to be a response to that, and I've called it an individuating response. You're really called then to speak out of your mind, because you can't just say anything if someone says, for God's sake, stop talking off the top of your head now, this really matters. Kierkegaard has this wonderful expression of living your life, your own life and nobody else's. And when you call somebody seriousness, that's what you're asking them to do. It's a place for the idea of authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think this gets quasi-technical, but if you ask what gives normative authority to concepts like sentimentality when they function as criticisms of thought, not feeling. If you come into the theatre and say, I came to understand something, and I say, yeah, and you think you did, it's being sentimental, I'm not criticising your feeling, I'm criticising what you now claim to believe.
Yeah.
So if you ask what gives normative authority to that, the question being analogous to what gives normative authority to the concept of irrational, right? Or what gives normative authority to the concept of an invalid influence, right? Well, I'd want to say what I'm calling a call to seriousness is partly what constitutes the normative authority of those concepts as critical concepts, by which I mean concepts which we use to assess whether we're thinking well or badly. So in that sense, conversation becomes utterly fundamental to the kinds of assessment, for example, of our response to someone's example. So when Aristotle says, if you want to know what justice is, look to the just man. But implicitly, I don't know if he says it, but implicitly, of course, you have to have eyes to see. It's so natural how the metaphor of vision functions there. But I want to say, when you're moved by someone you think to be just, and you ask yourself, have you been rightly moved or have you been conned by their charismatic personality, for example, then it's no good looking.
Yeah.
Then you have to reflect. So I disagree. I disagree very much with Iris Murdoch about this when she says there are two big metaphors in philosophy: the metaphor of vision and the metaphor of movement. That may be historically right. But her big example of this, which has become really famous, is in a kind of polemic against Wittgenstein's private language argument. She gives the example of a woman reflecting on her daughter-in-law, and the woman is M, and the daughter-in-law is D. And M had thought that D was always a bit vulgar, a bit noisy, a bit this and a bit that. And the example is of M just through reflection and attention, but nothing else, changing her view of D. But of course, I mean, what Murdoch doesn't think of here is of what D might think of and rethinking. And D might come up and say, for God's sake, you're so fucking arrogant. First of all, you thought I was a stroppy bore. Now you think I'm this and that. None of it was talking to me. You could have come up to me and said, hey, anyway, you could have, to put it in my language, you could have called me to a certain kind of seriousness when you're just there fuming over what you thought to be my vulgarity. But then you get away from vision, you get into dialogue.
So the call to seriousness almost always necessitates conversation, or
Yeah, I give an example of this in after Romulus, talking about horror, where, do you know?
I do. I've been wrestling with the essays in After Romulus all week, and this is one of the ones where I'm really glad that you're actually talking about it, because I think it's interesting, and it's a nuanced point as well.
Horror had fled from communism, and he thought it was a very, I think rightly thought it was a brutal regime. And he also thought, as many people did, I won't comment on whether it's right or wrong, but he thought that the communists had infiltrated the trade union movement and various other things. And when I was a student, I was attracted to quite radical left-wing politics. In fact, I flirted with joining the Communist Party. And I had a guitar, and Hor and I were living in the same house, renting rooms in the same house, and I went to his kitchen and said, "Do you want to hear a song?" And he said, "Yeah, fine." So I played this song, a union song, the scabs crawl in, the scabs crawl out, the scabs crawl under, and all about. And he lost his temper. So this is what university education does for you. Don't you know that the union's infiltrated by the communists? Don't you know what brutal mass murderers the communists have been, or in the Soviet Union and elsewhere? And he knew, of course I knew, because he told me. And he didn't speak to me for about 3 months. They were in the same house. And though I went into his kitchen a number of times trying to... Now, it's natural to take this as a simply example of a man turning his back on you, saying, I won't speak to you again in that tone. But I'm quite sure it wasn't that. It was just horror felt. If I could be so superficial as not to care that I was singing the praises of mass murderers or people associated with mass murderers who themselves didn't care about the mass murderers. If I could be so superficial, what could we ever talk about? Because, and you might say we could talk about all sorts of other things, right? Which of course is true. But the point I wanted to make about conversation is we might talk about anything, but it might come up at a certain point where someone says, "Well, how could you think that?" So he thought that what he had valued so much in our relationship, he thought, at least for some time, been made impossible. Because he thought I could never be brought to a seriousness because I have revealed myself to be so superficial about something so fundamentally important as the lives of thousands of people. So a chat about sailing on Cape Coron, but even that we couldn't talk about that because that had been so morally and deeply important to me. So if let's say, just imagine we were to reminisce about the days on Cape Coron, it would be a kind of reminiscence in bad faith from his perspective, because he would think that whatever he might have thought I'd got from that, clearly I hadn't.
That you had missed what he had tried to impart.
So I think he was literally incapable, or he thought it was ethically impossible to have a certain kind of conversation, but not that he was angrily turned his back on him.
The notion of a call to seriousness and the way that relates to the ability to converse and have dialogue. I'm curious if you try to take that notion and expand its scope to public dialogue or to the way that we have debates with each other in societies.
In fact, I do want to claim that take the recent election where people who think of themselves as progressives have been accused of a kind of condescension to people in Queensland and people in the mining communities. And let me tell a story that I think I've written about in a quarterly essay. When I was writing The Philosopher's Dog, I was renting a cottage out in the country. And I'd go into the pub and have a meal and talk to people. And it was the time of the Tampa crisis.
Mm.
And so we inevitably start talking about boat arrivals and things like that. And it was the time that children had been behind razor wire for up to 4 or 5 years. So the discussion would always go, well, you can't have queue jumpers, can you? And you can't let in, well, obviously you have to have an immigration policy, you can't just let anybody in, and so on. And I'd say yes, it's a complex thing, and of course you can't just let anybody in. But do you think we could possibly tolerate a policy which has children behind a razor wire watching adults sever their lips, and some adults trying to commit suicide?
Mm.
And they say, well, you can't have queue jumpers, and if you let the kids in, and so on and so on. And often this would be standing up at a bar, and so the physical aspect is important actually, because what I found interesting is when I said yes, but let's just focus on the children.
Mm.
They shuffle from one foot to another, and look away.
Mm.
And this was then a call to seriousness. I'd say, stop. Just look at me and tell me, can you have a policy? And in the end, they would say, no, we can't. And then I'd say, well, what about the adults now? And again, I know we can't let anybody in, but need we have a policy that is as cruel as this one is to them? And it would be the same thing. And it was actually quite literally getting them to stand still and look into your face. Mm. Talk about the embodied nature of conversation, necessarily embodied nature of the possibility of conversation. So when I heard a miner in Queensland say, look, I have to feed, I have to have a job, my kids have to have a job, my grandchildren need a job. There must have been then, of course there was the possibility of someone saying, hey, but we understand this. But think too about what will happen to your grandchildren if what people say about climate change. There is, I think of democratic politics as always envisaging the possibility of calling a fellow citizen to seriousness. Mm-hmm. To say, hey, look, you voted for this. It really buggers me up if this were to happen. Like this is what the miner says. Mm-hmm. They were wanting to call people down south
to call progressives to seriousness.
Yeah, so who do you think you are? You come up, you roll in with your
convoy,
with your caravan, and God knows what. So anyway, the tone of this person who says, "Look, I need a job. My children need a job." Mm. That was a call to seriousness, which has to be answered. So I think of democratic politics as being a politics in which you imagine your fellow citizens, and this is what's constitutive of them as your fellow citizens, as being people you could, at least in principle, if you were to meet them in a pub, call them to seriousness.
Now we're fast running out of time, so I think that's a really profound and thought-provoking note to end the interview on. Raimond Gaita, thank you so much for being with us here today.